Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Andrew Kirikoff, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, we're talking about my Week 2 running back rankings for the 2021 fantasy football season. On today's episodes, of course, we're going to be covering all topics related to the running back position, beginning with matchups. We'll talk about which defenses last week were giving up the most points to opposing running backs in a half PPR scoring format. Of course, talking about who has the most advantageous or perhaps the most disadvantageous matchup going into the week and how that's potentially going to impact their overall upside. After that, we'll talk about my top 36 running back rankings, as I'll give you guys my perspective and opinions as to how I think the running back position is going to stack up going into this week. We'll talk about the stats that justify my thought process. But of course, before we begin and start talking about all things related to the running back position, I want to go ahead and once again thank you guys for helping us get to 48,000 subscribers here on the channel. I mean, it is absolutely incredible the amount of support you guys have continued to show me. Again, we are very close to getting to 50,000. So if you have not yet already and you're trying to stay up to date on the latest fantasy football content and of course help you win yourself a 2021 fantasy football championship, this is the channel to do it, so subscribe down below. Once again, thank you very much for coming out every day with your viewership, commenting down below, sharing with family and friends, though I understand it's difficult throughout the 2021 season, and of course, smashing that like button every single day. Thank you once again for the incredible support. All right, so before we begin, I just want to go ahead and mention again that this is going to be for a half PPR scoring format, meeting everyone in the middle, whether you do play in a full PPR or a standard, and the timestamps for individual players are down below in the description of the video. While you're down there, you can check out my Patreon. The link is down there for those of you who are trying to get all of your 2021 fantasy football questions answered this upcoming season, along with my entirety of my rankings for half and full PPR. You can find that via my Patreon with the support there. Again, for those of you who are already there supporting, thank you very much. All right, let's get into talking about the running back position, beginning with matchups. We're going to take a little bit of a different approach here and talk about which defenses gave up the most points to opposing running backs last week in a half PPR scoring format. Again, to the left of me, you can see the chart that says 2021 running back fantasy points allowed. Now, the number one ranked team gave the most points up to opposing running backs in comparison to the number 32 team, which gave up the fewest. You obviously want to play a team that is ranked in the 1 through 10 range in comparison to the opposite. Now, of course, the San Francisco 49ers, they were in quite the shootout against the Detroit Lions. What was it, a 41-33 game? Of course, the duo of Jamaal Williams and DeAndre Swift both put up 20-plus points in a half PPR scoring format, and that's certainly going to make, a pretty big difference. But we'll talk about their impact this upcoming week and what the potential of Miles Sanders is going to be this upcoming week, and or if Kenneth Gainwell is going to have himself any sort of potential upside in the matchup, based on, of course, the fact that the receiving game for the running back position against the 49ers was such a great spot for the Lions, and they continue to exploit it for the entire game. Now, of course, the Kansas City Chiefs, between the duo of Nick Chubb and Kareem Hunt, both of them scored touchdowns. In fact, there was 3 touchdowns between the two of them. They got a good amount of work, whether it was on the ground or through the air, and they were able to stay within the matchup, and that was the biggest question, whether or not you can keep the ball out of Mahomes' hands, maintain a lead, and run the ball, and that's exactly what they did to find a lot of success in fantasy. The Jacksonville Jaguars, of course, they gave up a lot of points. In fact, gave up a touchdown to all 3 running backs of the Houston Texans, whether it was Mark Ingram, David Johnson, and or Phillip Lindsay. The Detroit Lions, of course, are the 4th best matchup. Elijah Mitchell, regardless of what happened to Raheem Mostert, breaking news, of course, as of today, Raheem Mostert is undergoing season-ending injury, but of course, Elijah Mitchell, he's the number 1 waiver wire targeted guy we absolutely are going after this week. Just kind of giving you some perspective. Of course, these teams gave up the most points. On the other side of the board, we have teams like the New Orleans Saints, who have commonly been in this bottom range of not giving many points up to opposing running backs over the last couple seasons. Similar with the Denver Broncos, but the Buffalo Bills, that is a quite, big surprise. The Carolina Panthers were a surprise. The Cleveland Browns were a surprise. But the Pittsburgh Steelers, Dallas Cowboys, Tampa Bay Buccaneers, these are teams that year over year have not given up a lot of points to opposing running backs. Now that we've gone ahead and talked about this, I want to also go ahead and isolate the 2021 rushing statistics allowed. I've talked about it ad nauseum in my running back strength of schedule video that I posted this offseason, that offensive coordinators aren't scheming potentially, hey, you know what, we're going to go after this linebacker because he can't cover in the flat. Yes, there's a possibility that could happen throughout a weekly basis, but that typically isn't the schematic form of how offensive coordinators approach every single week. If you are in a team that is going to highly target the running back position, regardless of who you are playing, you are going to continue to target the running back position. There's a reason why the Detroit Lions had, 18 receptions between the two of Jamaal Williams and DeAndre Swift because their offensive coordinator is Anthony Lynn, formerly of the Chargers. We talked about it all offseason. They're going to feed their running backs the ball in the PPR game, and they're going to find a lot of value in doing so because the receptions in a half or full PPR, which is going to separate them amongst their peers and obviously elevate their overall potential on a weekly basis. Now, this is why I want to, of course, cover rushing statistics a lot, because though the receiving game often has to do with the offense that you're associated with and the scheme that they want to run, and whether or not they want to involve their running backs in the passing game, the rushing statistics are undeniable. If a defense is getting torched up front, they're probably going to continue to struggle. And that has obviously been the case for the Kansas City Chiefs, Detroit Lions, Jacksonville Jaguars, Las Vegas Raiders, and Minnesota Vikings. And funny enough, if you go back to the 2020 season and you look at the teams that were giving up the most points to opposing running backs on the ground, those were the 5 teams amongst the top 10. It's no surprise that they're once again there because, again, their main defensive structure is always going to be struggling because they've got issues, whether it is coordinator-wise or talent-wise, in terms of stopping the run. All right, now that we've gone ahead and covered that, and we've gone ahead and established who exactly is potentially at the most advantageous or most disadvantageous matchup this upcoming week, I want to return and talk about my top 36 running back rankings for week 2 of the 2021 fantasy football season. We'll go ahead and begin with our number 1, Christian McCaffrey. It shouldn't be a surprise considering the fact that in a half PPR, he finishes the number 1 overall running back in week 1, and he didn't even have to score a touchdown. That's the crazy part. On top of the fact that he had himself, 9 receptions, 9 targets, 89 receiving yards, had himself 98 rushing yards on the ground with 21 total rushing attempts. Ultimately, with the 23.2 fantasy points, you typically wouldn't finish as the number 1, but the competition at the running back position wasn't as stacked in week 1 in comparison to weeks past and or years past. Regardless, he played 89% of the offensive snaps, and going into this upcoming week, he plays against the New Orleans Saints. The question is, what are the Saints going to potentially do? Because what Aaron Jones produced last week was quite jarring for many of us. He only had 5 rushing attempts for 9 rushing yards, which is awful. Yes, he got some PPR work, but ultimately Aaron Jones was nullified in that game. I don't think Christian McCaffrey is going to be nullified. I think he'll be absolutely fantastic when we go back to the last couple games that he's played against the New Orleans Saints, specifically in 2019, because again, he was injured for 13 of the 16 games last season and didn't get to participate in the games against the New Orleans Saints. In 2019, he put up 29.8 and 19.3 fantasy points in a half PPR scoring format against the Saints. In both contests combined, he was averaging only 2.9 yards per carry on the ground, which isn't a surprise because, again, we talked about the Saints are one of the best run-stopping defenses in the league with what they have up front. But he luckily had 16 receptions in those 2 games, one with 7 and one with 9, of course, which saves his week. So like I always mention, regardless of who Christian McCaffrey is playing, he is matchup proof, and he's absolutely going to produce against the New Orleans Saints this week. Moving on to our number 2 running back, we have Alvin Kamara. Now, this is the opposite side of the coin. Of course, these 2 running backs going up against each other this upcoming week. I think Alvin Kamara is a fantastic play. Besides the fact that he plays against the Carolina Panthers, which, yes, they didn't give up very many points to running backs last week, but they played against the New York Jets, and they are awful in terms of running the ball. They had an offensive lineman go out with an injury, so it just all went bad early for them. But when we talk about what Alvin Kamara could potentially do against this defense, I honestly think there's a very high potential of Alvin Kamara stepping in and doing exactly what he did last week, but at an even more advanced basis, because we have to remember, Alvin Kamara only played 3 quarters against the Green Bay Packers. He didn't have to play in the 4th quarter because it was already a blowout at that point. They pulled him out. They put in Tony Jones Jr. and let Tony Jones Jr. run the ball 11 times for 50 yards. So again, this week, besides the fact that, of course, we're going to see Alvin Kamara get himself work on the ground. Last week had himself 20 rushing attempts for 83 rushing yards. He got himself a receiving touchdown. I think he'll get an even more expanded role because when we look at what he's been able to do against the Carolina Panthers, and running backs have been able to do against the Carolina Panthers week and year over year for the last couple seasons, it's just been automatic points. Specifically, Alvin Kamara in the last 5 games he's played against the Panthers has averaged 19.82 fantasy points per game and a half PPR. I think he's absolutely in line for a fantastic performance. That is why he's my number 2. Moving on to our number 3, we have Dalvin Cook of the Minnesota Vikings playing against the Arizona Cardinals. Now, we know that the Arizona Cardinals were fantastic defensively this past week. Were able to shut down Derrick Henry and pretty much eliminate him from the game due to the game script, of course. Because, again, the Tennessee Titans turned over the ball very early and often. Of course, with Chandler Jones absolutely tearing apart Taylor Lewan in terms of the pass rush. It obviously forced the Tennessee Titans to have to pass for the entire second half. And when they had to, Derrick Henry was rendered to only running the ball 17 times for 58 total yards on the ground. And again, when we're talking about a guy who's the 8th running back in NFL history to run for 2,000 yards, it's pretty surprising that they weren't able to get him going early enough to where they could mitigate, of course, the game script getting out of hand. But they truly couldn't. Now the question is, what can Dalvin Cook, coming off of a performance in which he only averaged 3 yards per carry against the Cincinnati Bengals defense, what can he do this upcoming week? Yes, he's coming off a 17.5 point fantasy point performance, but I think regardless of what Arizona is going to put up in front of them, Dalvin Cook is a guy that is matchup proof. There's a reason why he was able to catch 6 passes on 7 targets last week for 43 yards and get himself that extra value. He continues to be a dynamic running back on all 3 downs. And when I think about the Arizona Cardinals defense, last season, they only allowed one 100-yard rusher. Similar to Dalvin Cook, he's kind of a guy that breaks those kind of records. Last season alone, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers didn't allow a single 100-yard rusher until Dalvin Cook came into town. I think if anybody's going to be able to kind of break this, I think Dalvin Cook is going to be able to do so. We have a team that looks so good in the Arizona Cardinals and a Minnesota Vikings team that really struggled to get anything going offensively this last week. I think we'll see them kind of meet in the middle, and Dalvin Cook certainly find himself a fantastic fantasy point performance this week. Number 4 is Nick Chubb. Again, Nick Chubb had a fantastic game against the Kansas City Chiefs. Of course, later on in the game was kind of taken out of the overall scheme because, of course, they had to pass the ball in the second half because they were down against the Kansas City Chiefs offense. But prior to that, the guy had 15 rushing attempts, 83 rushing yards, 2 rushing touchdowns, 2 catches on 2 targets for 18 receiving yards, all for 21.1 fantasy points. That's fantastic. And to be honest, the better part of this entire conversation in terms of Nick Chubb is his week 2 matchup. He gets to take on the Houston Texans, and we know how bad they are. The Houston Texans were giving up 29.75 fantasy points per game to running backs last season, and in fact played against Nick Chubb last year. Nick Chubb, once he returned from his injury, took on the Houston Texans in week 10, and Nick Chubb was an absolute monster in that game, had himself 19 carries for 126 and a touchdown, 18.6 fantasy points in that contest. And again, he was only returning from injury in that contest. I think absolutely Nick Chubb is going to be in the rotation. He's a huge part of this offense. And from what we've been able to see thus far and at the back end of last year, Kevin Stefanski has truly found his stride as an offensive coordinator in this scheme, and they're continuing to rip apart teams. And I believe Nick Chubb could very easily go from being my number 4 to maybe even the number 1 this week with a couple big runs against the Houston Texans defense that, again, wasn't able to be exposed this last week by the Jaguars, but certainly will this week. Aaron Jones is my number 5, and I know many of you who have Aaron Jones, you spent a first-round pick to go ahead and bring this talent to your team, a running back that has been a top 5 running back in back-to-back seasons in a half PPR scoring format. Don't tilt, relax. He gets to play against the Detroit Lions, and we know, Elijah Mitchell was able to come out of nowhere last week, have 19 carries for 104 rushing yards and a rushing touchdown, and be a fantastic fantasy option against that defense. I mean, even prior to Elijah Mitchell coming in, Raheem Mostert had 2 carries for 20 yards. He was ripping off runs prior to his injury. We know the Detroit Lions cannot stop the run. That is just a fact, and that's going to continue to be the case going forward. And regardless of what happened to Aaron Jones this last week against the Saints, they're going to put that behind them, and you should put that behind you because Aaron Jones is a must-start every single week. Last season when he played against the Detroit Lions, let's not forget, he had a 43.6-point game against them. I wanted to go ahead and make a pause there because it is a huge performance, 43 points against that defense. Aaron Jones is going to get back into this, kind of groove, and I believe the entire team for the Green Bay Packers had a little bit of a reality check last week. They've been checked. They're going to now, of course, keep themselves accountable and come out this week and definitely put a number in on the Detroit Lions defense, especially in terms of running the ball. Aaron Jones is my number 5. Moving on to our number 6, we have ourselves Derrick Henry playing against the Seattle Seahawks. Now I understand, Derrick Henry, another disappointing performance, only had himself 9.2 fantasy points last week. Now, if you go back to week 1 of the 2020 season when they played against the Denver Broncos, he similarly had a little bit of a lackluster performance, wasn't able to get the offense moving, and eventually, as the season progressed, they continued to rely upon him, got into better game script situations, and were able to let Derrick Henry feast. And I think they're going to eventually get back into that. They have to get a couple weeks to warm up. Their offensive line looked awful this past week, and that in itself is going to be the biggest difference maker as to whether or not Derrick Henry can take it to the next level. He plays against the Seahawks. We saw Jonathan Taylor and Nyheim Hines both play well, but mainly in the passing game. Both those running backs had 6 receptions apiece, and I don't know if Derrick Henry is going to be able to get himself that kind of work. So he's going to rely upon not only getting himself upwards of 20 carries, but getting himself in the end zone. And in order to do so, they have to stay in the game. They have to stay within the game script, because if Russell Wilson starts to pull away and Ryan Tannehill can't keep up with them, that's going to be an issue ultimately. That being said, the Indianapolis Colts this last week with Jonathan Taylor and Nyheim Hines, they had 26 total rushing attempts for 90 rushing yards. They were able to move the ball on the ground. And I think certainly, of course, a guy like Derrick Henry, he'll be able to move the ball. I'm not really worried about him in the matchup at hand. I think he himself, another one of these matchup-proof guys, but hopefully his team doesn't get himself out of the running. We have Joe Mixon as our number 7. Joe Mixon was an incredible running back last week. His performance was the number 2 amongst all running backs, only behind Christian McCaffrey, with 23 fantasy points. This gentleman ran the ball 29 times and caught it 4 times on 4 targets, a total of 33 touches. I mean, that in itself is unreal. I mean, he had the most touches amongst all running backs last week, and it shouldn't be a surprise. Again, when we talked about the last 15 games of his career prior to week 1 of the 2021 season, he was averaging about 26 touches per game. The offensive coordinator of the Cincinnati Bengals this offseason said, Joe Mixon is not coming off the field. He is a 3-down back, and with the absence of Giovanni Bernard, this was an expectation, and of course, he delivered on said expectations with a great performance. This upcoming week takes on the Chicago Bears. Darrell Henderson was able to find success against that defense, but mainly because the offense throughout the passing game was able to get him into the end zone. Outside of that, Darrell Henderson benefited from a lot of late rushing attempts. I think the Chicago Bears defense up front, they're pretty stout, and I 100% believe this is going to be a tougher matchup for Joe Mixon, but regardless of that, there's a matter of accuracy by volume. Because he's going to touch the ball 25 times, regardless of whether he gets 3 yards per carry, he is still going to find himself a lot of success. And the rest of this offense, passing-wise, though Joe Burrow was pressured a lot last week, was running for his life, I really do believe they're going to be able to get the ball into the red zone and get Joe Mixon that extra touchdown. And, of course, find himself even more value on top of course, whatever his volume brings. We have our number 8, Najee Harris. Now I understand, for those of you who selected Najee Harris in the first or second round, of your respective draft, he did not perform. But the number 1 statistic that, in my opinion, speaks volumes and tells me that, yes, Najee Harris is going to be a huge part of this offense rest of season, and his schedule is definitely going to help him, especially considering he plays against the Las Vegas Raiders this upcoming week, is the fact that he played 100% of the offensive snap share. He never came off the field. He played as much as Ben Roethlisberger. He was on the field for every snap, and though I went ahead and I watched the film, that offensive line in the first half was awful. And we know that. We know that there is going to be a situation in which his offensive line does not help him. And that certainly was the case. I mean, he was getting contacted 3 yards into the backfield every single rushing attempt in that first half. And yeah, eventually in the second half, they were able to at least use some play action, force the secondary to kind of push off, not stack as many people in the box. And eventually, Najee Harris was able to make some breakout runs, but ultimately wasn't able to do much with only 5.4 fantasy points. I still believe that, the statistics that we all look at, 16 carries, 45 yards, 1 catch for 4 yards, it doesn't give us the entire story. There were multiple attempts in which Najee Harris had red zone targets within the 10-yard and in, and had rushing attempts from the 10-yard line and in, and wasn't able to deliver. Again, he's a rookie. He will eventually find himself success that, in those specific attempts. And I think against the Las Vegas Raiders, he can certainly do so. Again, the Raiders were torched by Tyson Williams and Latavius Murray on last night's Monday Night Football game. I absolutely believe that there is going to be a potential in which Najee Harris takes it to the next level, finds himself a very good performance this upcoming week against a very bad defense. We have Ezekiel Elliott as our number 9, another running back that, again, do not tilt about. Ezekiel Elliott was not a factor in Thursday night's football game against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. We know that. For those of us who watched the game, you understand that he just wasn't a part of the scheme. And though you look at the 4.9 fantasy points and wonder, man, is it even worth keeping Zeke? Trust me, it is. He played 84.34% of the offensive snaps. He pass blocked for majority of the game. And according to Kellen Moore, the offensive coordinator of the Dallas Cowboys, Kellen Moore said he called 28 running plays throughout that game. Now you may be wondering, okay, well, that seems like a lot of running plays considering Zeke only had 11 rushing attempts. But in the case of those 28 running plays that were called, Dak Prescott audibled out of 13 of them. So again, when we look at what the potential of, what Ezekiel Elliott is going into this upcoming week, playing against the Los Angeles Chargers is a far more sustainable matchup for him. Yes, he will not have Lyle Collins. He's going to be on a 5-game suspension, but they'll hopefully get Zach Martin back. That's their best offensive lineman. and they'll continue to run the ball, and they'll continue to put up points. Trust me, Zeke is going to get back on track. I believe he'll do so this upcoming week. When we look at what Antonio Gibson was able to do against that defense, regardless of what happened to Ryan Fitzpatrick, I think Zeke, he himself is going to have himself a breakout game, find the end zone, get himself more work in the passing game, of course. We have Jonathan Taylor as our number 10. Jonathan Taylor played well. I mean, he was the leading receiving option of the Colts this past week, which is a huge thing, whether it is half or full PPR scoring formats, considering if Carson Wentz is going to use the running back position as close to what maybe perhaps Phillip Rivers did last year, then Jonathan Taylor and Nyheim Hines are going to feast week over week. They get to play against the Los Angeles Rams this upcoming week. Though David Montgomery and Damien Williams were both able to find a lot of success, they combined for 24.3 fantasy points against that stout Rams defense. I think Jonathan Taylor having himself the 17 rushing attempts and, of course, the 6 receptions on 7 targets is huge. We know that he is a big part of this offense. Could have had himself a receiving touchdown. They ran a screen pass down on the 10-yard line. Unfortunately, one of the defensive linemen were able to hawk him down as he was getting to the 3-yard line. He scores. He ends up being a 20-point guy. He becomes a top 5 running back last week. I think the potential is always going to be there of him getting to that next level. It's just a matter of the matchup. And yes, Montgomery was able to run through this defense. I don't think this defense will be as bad, but you never know. You have a significantly better offensive line with the Indianapolis Colts going up against the Rams. It'll be in Indy. Carson Wentz has had some success against this defense in his career thus far. To be honest, I think Jonathan Taylor, a big option this upcoming week. Marlon Mack's complete absence even helped more in terms of solidifying his value. It's absolutely fantastic. Number 11 is Antonio Gibson. We talked about Antonio Gibson, but the first thing I want to mention about him is, of course, going into the Thursday night game. Again, they're on a very short week. He did come off of 20 rushing attempts for 90 yards, 5 targets, 3 receptions for 18 receiving yards, and 10.3 fantasy points. He did sustain a shoulder injury. If, in fact, he is not able to go, then we'll obviously pivot to J.D. McKissic, but I think he's going to be fine. Based on what we've seen, if they were to practice yesterday, he would have been a full upgrade. He would have been a full go. So, yes, they didn't practice yesterday because it's Monday and they were just pretty much recovering and watching film and getting ready for the next game. I do believe that Antonio Gibson is going to be fine and he's going to produce this upcoming week. Now, when we look at what the New York Giants have in store, they played against the Denver Broncos this last week. Melvin Gordon and, of course, Javonte Williams, they combined for a total of 25 rushing attempts for 146 rushing yards and a rushing touchdown. That's great. And that, to be honest, should be a pretty good matchup for Antonio Gibson. But when I go and I look at what Antonio Gibson has produced against the New York Giants in last season's games, specifically in the 2 contests he played against them, first one, 9 carries, 30 yards, 4 catches, 25 yards. That's it. The next game, 6 carries, 20 yards, 1 rushing touchdown, 3 catches, 35 yards. At best, he was a 10-point player against them last year. And that in itself is a little concerning. But hopefully we've kind of, shifted into a direction in which we're going to continue to use Antonio Gibson more than 9 times or 6 times on the ground, which, of course, last week pretty much tipped their hat. Yes, they're going to continue to run the ball heavily. This is a run-blocking heavy offensive line. And I think, of course, the ineptitude of the New York Giants is going to lead to this game being closer, regardless of Taylor Heinicke being the starter quarterback and him having struggles. I do believe it's going to be a close enough game where we'll see Antonio Gibson run the ball 20 to 25 times and find himself incredible value with that kind of volume. Austin Ekeler is my number 12. Austin Ekeler surprisingly had himself a good week, mainly because he scored a touchdown. If Austin Ekeler doesn't score a touchdown, he finishes the week with 15 rushing attempts for 57 yards. That in itself is scary, because that rushing touchdown is a huge difference maker to get him to that 11.7 fantasy point mark and saves many people's weeks. But the issue that I found with Austin Ekeler last week was that he didn't run a single route. That is scary to me. And yes, we knew he was going to be limited. He had been limited all week long in practice. And the fact that he even played on Sunday against the Washington football team of all defenses was a surprise. But we have to remember again, Austin Ekeler not running routes is a problem. And if he's not going to run routes, he is not my number 12. I would move him down significantly more. I need to see Austin Ekeler have a full week of practice, or at least 2 practices consecutively, Thursday and Friday, in which he's full go. Because if we can get Austin Ekeler running the ball 15 times a game, getting the goal line carries, and catching the ball potentially 6 or more times out of the backfield, he's easily even higher than the number 12 overall spot based on volume and opportunity in a PPR scoring format. I think Austin Ekeler is a potential huge play this week playing against the Dallas Cowboys, but it has to, of course, line up. If he doesn't get those receptions, if he's not running routes, then I'm not interested there. There's a reason why, guys, that Jared Cook and, of course, Mike Williams were getting those kind of targets because Austin Ekeler didn't run a route. So remember, if Austin Ekeler isn't a full go, we'll, of course, keep an eye on it and we'll adjust the rankings accordingly because we have to remember rankings are subject to change, like I always mention. But for right now, he will sit here as our number 12 because, of course, his upside is huge if he's a full go. Our number 13 for this week is David Montgomery. David Montgomery was a fantastic running back option this last week, and I didn't think it was going to actually be the case. He played against the Rams, and he torched them on the ground. Even with his left tackle, Jason Peters, leaving the game with an injury, David Montgomery was a solid running back play. 16 rushes, 108 rushing yards, 1 rushing touchdown. But the issues that reside with David Montgomery that don't allow him to get into my top 12 as of right now is the fact that, first and foremost, he didn't get much receiving work in this game. Damien Williams was a target machine and pretty much rendered David Montgomery to 1 target, 1 reception for 10 yards. And though David Montgomery can certainly be a 3-down back, they didn't use him as such, which is unfortunate. But regardless, having played 60% of the snaps in the first 3 quarters of this game was huge. Now you may be wondering, Andrew, why did you mention the first 3 quarters? Because David Montgomery didn't play in the 4th quarter, guys. I don't know if you watched that game, but he left with a finger injury. And I watched the post-game interview with David Montgomery with the press, and he had himself his index finger on his right hand wrapped up. Everything that we saw during the game was that, and what I've heard from rumors, basically nothing confirmed yet by the organization, is that he dislocated his finger. Based on the questions he was asked during the interview, someone asked him, "How's your finger?" We see that it's wrapped up. He said, "I'm fine." It pretty much was wrapped up. Didn't need a stint. Doesn't require surgery. So ultimately, we're fine there. Good to go. So when we think about, okay, what is the potential of David Montgomery this upcoming week if he's fully healthy in this lineup? Playing against the Cincinnati Bengals is a very advantageous matchup. I don't care what Dalvin Cook was able to do against them. I know he didn't perform well on the ground, but this is a team that last season were giving up 125 yards per game on the ground alone to opposing running backs. I think David Montgomery's in a fantastic matchup. We have to keep in mind that, of course, the PPR upside of him is going to be reduced with Damien Williams, of course, getting that role. But ultimately, David Montgomery, fantastic play going into this week's matchup. We have DeAndre Swift as our number 14. I think DeAndre Swift pretty much earned his position here, based on the fact that the guy was able to catch the ball. 8 times on 11 targets, 65 receiving yards, and a receiving touchdown. 11 rushing attempts, 39 rushing yards. Now, there's a couple things that we need to just point out and just throw it out on the table. DeAndre Swift benefited from the fact that the Detroit Lions ran the most offensive plays this last week. They ran 92. They were number 1. I think that the Buffalo Bills ran like 82 offensive plays, but in comparison, some other teams ran like 50 offensive plays this last week. The amount of volume of turnovers from the, of course, 49ers significantly had to play with the fact that DeAndre Swift was getting more and more opportunities, but ultimately he delivered on it regardless. And a lot of the touches out of this backfield went to Jamaal Williams, with, of course, Jamaal Williams having himself a fantastic performance as well. But again, DeAndre Swift playing against the Green Bay Packers. That is the question this upcoming week. Alvin Kamara was able to find himself some success against the Green Bay Packers, 16.5 fantasy points, and of course didn't play in the 4th quarter. That number could have been even more extended in terms of what their potential was. And last year, when I look at what DeAndre Swift was able to do against Green Bay, yes, he wasn't able to find much success on the ground, but through the air, he was a monster. In the 2 games he played against them, 9 receptions, 86 receiving yards, was able to score a touchdown against them in one of those 2 weeks that they played. But right now, DeAndre Swift playing almost 70% of the offensive snaps this last week, of course, rendering Jamaal Williams to the outside 30. It does lead me to believe that going into the weeks, now that he's more and more healthy and the team gains more confidence with him, he will certainly be a huge part of this offense. Like I mentioned, Anthony Lynn loves to feed his running backs the ball out of the backfield. That continues to rise their value week over week, and that is why DeAndre Swift sits here at our number 14 this upcoming week in a relatively good matchup against the Green Bay Packers. Moving on to our number 15, we have Chris Carson of the Seattle Seahawks. Now, he plays against Tennessee. That's a fantastic matchup. The Cardinals duo of Edmonds and Connor combined for 17.9 fantasy points against them. They ran the ball for over 100 between the two of them. This defense is still as bad as we remember. So what is Chris Carson's potential? Of course, coming off a game in which he had 91 rushing yards on 16 carries against a very stout Indianapolis Colts front 7. And of course, 3 catches on 3 targets for 26 yards, 11.2 fantasy points. Great overall performance. The guy played 78% of the offensive snaps. We'll take that. But the reason why I have Chris Carson as low as 15 is mainly because It's let Russ cook season. Now, what exactly does that mean? I'm sure we all saw the stat this last week in terms of how good Patrick Mahomes is in September. He's never turned over the ball in terms of interceptions. His passer rating's, nearly perfect. He's been an absolute monster. Hasn't lost a game in September. All these kind of stats, whatever. The whole point of that entire dialogue is to kind of give you some perspective because Russell Wilson is in a similar position. Last season in September, he had 14 touchdowns in the first 3 games of the season in September. And to be honest, I think we're going to see something similar to that in the next couple games because Russell Wilson starts out every season on fire. He just does. That's what he does, and that is what he's consistently done. He came off a 4 passing touchdown game, and playing against the Tennessee Titans isn't going to slow him down. And that does kind of potentially decrease the value of Carson if they don't need him, if they're not going to give him those red zone rushing attempts. But ultimately, Carson will find himself value. And if he scores a touchdown, he'll be better than 15 in my opinion. But as of right now, he's a solid play considering the amount of volume he gets and, of course, his effectiveness regardless of what he plays against defensively. We have Kareem Hunt as our number 16. It's far too advantageous of a matchup not to play Kareem Hunt this upcoming week, and that's why I have him at 16. This is a pretty high ranking in comparison to where I had him last week, which was the high 20s. As of right now, playing against Houston, it's as good as it gets. Like I mentioned earlier, Houston last season were giving up 29.75 fantasy points per game to opposing running backs in a half PPR scoring format. Though, Kareem Hunt only touched the ball 9 times this last week, he still got himself 15.6 fantasy points. Of course, getting himself a rushing touchdown and a 2-point conversion early in that game. Last season, when they played against the Houston Texans, Kareem Hunt even had more touches than Nick Chubb, had himself 19 carries for 104 rushing yards and 3 receptions for 28 receiving yards. I believe that Kareem Hunt's going to be a huge part of this offense going forward, and if and when they take the huge lead, he's of course going to run the clock out in the second half and continue to gain his overall fantasy production and value upside. That is why he sits as my number 16. Moving on to our number 17, we have Miles Sanders, who takes on the San Francisco 49ers. I don't think it's a terrible matchup. I still do believe that the San Francisco 49ers are a good defense. Now, let me explain to you why. Kyle Shanahan, after the game, blatantly said, I pulled my starters out of that game. We were up 24 in the fourth quarter. I pulled them out. And of course, the Detroit Lions, they rallied back, and good on the Detroit Lions. And of course, after Verrett had, tore his ACL, and of course, Raheem Mostert went down, Kyle Shanahan went on, I'm defending and kind of protecting my players and pulling them out early because I don't want to have the injuries that I sustained last year that pretty much knocked us out of any contention. So he played defensively in terms of his coaching style this past Sunday. And of course, that led to the Lions running backs having 16 receptions and 20 rushing attempts, both of them surpassing 20 fantasy points because they both scored a touchdown between Swift and Jamaal Williams. Now, with that all said, I think Miles Sanders looked really good this last week. 15 carries for 75 rushing yards, 4 receptions for 39 receiving yards, and 15.5 fantasy points. That's great. We'll take that. Playing 66% of the offensive snaps is great considering also the fact that he didn't even play in the fourth quarter. This game was out of hand very quickly because the Atlanta Falcons were just non-existent in the second half of this game. And absolutely the Eagles took advantage of it. Going into this upcoming week, they'll potentially exploit the exact same factors that the Detroit Lions did in terms of passing the ball to the running back position. And I think Miles Sanders can be a huge part of that. So can Kenneth Gainwell. But regardless, I think Miles Sanders by himself, a great option. The offensive line was moving bodies this last week, which is a huge difference maker in comparison to years past for this Eagles team. It was a great job by Sanders, and I think he'll be another great play this week. Damien Harris is my number 18. Again, volume is king and opportunity is king in fantasy football, and this man had 23 rushing attempts for 100 rushing yards, 2 receptions on 3 targets for 17 receiving yards. We didn't expect him to get work in the receiving game, but I'm glad to see it. He unfortunately fumbled the ball late. Could have led to him potentially scoring a rushing touchdown in the contest, getting himself a 10.5 fantasy point performance to 16, getting into the top 10 conversation. But regardless, plays against the Jets. We know how bad the Jets are. They, though Robert Saleh is their defensive coordinator, they're going to be abused. And I absolutely expect Damien Harris to find success. Last time Damien Harris played against the Jets last season, 14 carries, 71 yards. Even Sony Michel in Week 17 against the Jets, 136 all-purpose yards and a touchdown. I expect the starting running back of the New England Patriots to find success. That is absolutely going to be Damien Harris. The last statistic I wanted to mention, he played 53% of the offensive snaps. That's fine. That's good, especially for a guy that's only running the ball in majority. The thing that I wanted to mention is that Bill Belichick versus rookie quarterbacks. Again, they play against the Jets. Zach Wilson's going to be in shambles. Bill Belichick since 2000 is 21-6 against rookie quarterbacks. they're going to absolutely make his life a living hell. And if and when they do, they're going to maintain a very sustainable lead, and Damien Harris is going to run out the clock in the second half. Find a lot of value there. Darrell Henderson's our number 19. Darrell Henderson's a very interesting prospect. Though he had himself success against the Chicago Bears defense, it wasn't enough to give me the utmost of confidence. But what gives me confidence in the scenario is that he played 94.23% of the offensive snaps. We only saw Sony Michel run the ball once. That is fantastic. We love to see that, especially considering the fact that he plays against the Indianapolis Colts this upcoming week at Indianapolis. And of course, he's going to be, kind of relied upon to run the ball as consistently as perhaps Chris Carson did last week. Of course, Chris Carson was able to just open up his own holes and pretty much just plow through the defenders. I don't know if Darrell Henderson's that kind of a running back. I've talked about it in the past. He is a speedster. He needs to find a lane and go rather than pretty much drop his shoulder and let everybody kind of move out of his direction. But regardless, I think Darrell Henderson, coming off of a 15-point fantasy point game, is great. The main issue I find with Darrell Henderson is that in the first 3 quarters of the game against the Chicago Bears, he had 29 total yards and 1 touchdown. He ended up getting 58 of his yards in the fourth quarter by running the clock out. If they don't get in a situation in which they can consistently run the ball early and they're relying on Matthew Stafford to throw, that's going to be an issue when Darrell Henderson is completely evaporated out of a lineup because they can't run the ball in the second half because they have to catch up or they have to continue to throw the ball. That is my only concern. Hopefully that'll change in the coming weeks. But regardless, Darrell Henderson, still a fantastic play based on the offense he's associated with and the amount of opportunity he's getting, whether it is just being on the field or in terms of attempts in comparison to Michel. Our number 20 for this upcoming week is Elijah Mitchell. Elijah Mitchell, of course, in terms of what he was able to do, 19 carries, 104 yards, and a touchdown, fantastic. Like I mentioned earlier today, Raheem Mostert had season-ending knee surgery, so he's done. He's not coming back. Trey Sermon was the guy of this entire offseason. Oh, well, let's get Trey, because he's going to be the lead back after Raheem Mostert gets hurt. Unfortunately, it's going to be Elijah Mitchell for those of you who invested in Trey Sermon relatively early in your drafts. But as of right now, just to kind of give you some perspective, of course, I think Elijah Mitchell is going to find success because this offense is predicated on running the ball. They've got 2 of the best run-blocking offensive tackles in the league, and they're going to bulldoze with George Kittle, of course, Kyle Juszczyk, and their interior of their offensive line that they've significantly improved this offseason through free agency. Elijah Mitchell, he's an automatic stud this week based on, of course, what he is going to be associated with just schematically for Kyle Shanahan's offense. The thing that I want to mention with Sermon, and for those of you who are worried about him, he was a healthy scratch list last week. He was not on the injury report. So what does that mean? They purposely told him not to dress. He's not injured. Healthy scratch is just the term that they use for, hey, you're not going to be used in special teams, so we can't have you as our third running back, and you're not going to play. So there you go. And that is what Elijah Mitchell, a 6th-round pick, has rendered a 3rd-round pick like Sermon. So as of right now, Elijah Mitchell's a fantastic play. Schematically, he's going to get the ball a lot, and he's going to find a lot of success. Number 21 is Clyde Edwards-Helaire. Clyde Edwards against Baltimore is going to be interesting because Baltimore, they were able to give up points to Josh Jacobs, which was quite the surprise. But again, the fact that the Raiders won last night was quite the surprise nonetheless. Of course, the turnovers and the mistakes, that is always going to catch up to you in the long run. And of course, Derek Carr was able to ball out and secure the ball and secure the victory. Regardless, Clyde Edwards played 72.3% of the offensive snaps for the Kansas City Chiefs this past week. And with that all being the case, he still wasn't able to find more than 17 total touches. Again, he needs a touchdown. 3 catches for 29 yards, 14 rushes for 43 against Cleveland. I know Cleveland's improved their defense. Baltimore's not the easiest matchup either. And that is why I have Clyde Edwards down here, because unless he's going to catch the ball 7-8 times, which again, he's not going to because this offense is pretty much running through Travis Kelce and Tyreek Hill. I think this current moment in time, we have to wait and see a better matchup for Clyde Edwards to have full confidence in him in a top 20, sense. But as of right now, if you have him, I'm starting him because he's getting touches. And as long as he potentially gets a touchdown in this upcoming game, he can get himself in that 13-point category in comparison to leaving us in the dirt with, 8.5, 8.7 like he did last week, which again is unfortunate, but hopefully he can build on that this upcoming week. We move on to Tyson Williams. Now, I understand that Tyson Williams may be a contested issue at this current moment in time, considering Latavius Murray and his second half uproar of opportunity. But let's just make it clear. Tyson Williams was a monster. 9 carries, 65 yards, and a rushing touchdown. Had a huge breakout run and was highly used in the passing game. We have not seen Ravens running backs often used in the passing game. 4 targets, 3 receptions, 29 yards for 16.9 fantasy points. Now, the issue with Tyson Williams in the second half, and the reason why he was replaced, is because he can't pass block. And the issue with that is going to be a problem when they play against the Kansas City Chiefs. And Latavius Murray has to come in because they're going to have to protect Lamar Jackson in the pocket, and they have to throw the entire game because they can't keep up with the Chiefs. As of this current moment in time, I think Tyson Williams is still going to see a lot of work this upcoming week, and I understand that Latavius Murray can be creeping and potentially taking more and more work from them, but we got to remember this backfield has been able to sustain 3 rushing options in the past. Last year we had Lamar Jackson, Gus Edwards, and J.K. Dobbins all in a singular week, all finding success. And I think they can certainly do that this upcoming year with Lamar Jackson, Tyson Williams, and Latavius Murray. But again, Tyson Williams looked fantastic. The Kansas City Chiefs could not stop the run last week. And the main thing that I saw from film, Alejandro Villanueva, their right tackle, was awful. He sold Tyson Williams in the fact that the defensive end pinches in. They're running a stunt. He literally steps on the inside, the power step, and bring him to the guard, but he never comes back out for the defensive end, leaves Tyson Williams to try to block Carl Nassib, 6'7" monster. He's not going to. He can't. He can maybe chop him at his legs, but he was already coming in, got in, and of course, forced the fumble on Lamar Jackson, which is the reason why Tyson Williams kind of fell out of favor in that second half. But regardless, as of right now, I still believe Tyson Williams, based on after the fact that they're going to watch film, they're going to realize they need him in the game in the second half. Chase Edmonds is my number 23. We have Chase Edmonds, who is coming off a relatively good game, a total of 16 touches for 106 yards. Fantastic. Plays against Minnesota. It's a great matchup. Mixon went for 23 on them. Of course, Mixon had a bunch of touches, but I think Chase Edmonds playing 60% of the offensive snaps in comparison to, of course, James Conner, which, again, they did split carries, but James Conner was, of course, less effective, which is anticipated. I think Chase Edmonds is going to continue to carve out more and more of a role, potentially get to that 70% snap count percentage, and solidify himself as an RB2 every single week. Against Minnesota, again, like I've talked about, they really cannot stop the run. I know Anthony Barr out last week, it didn't help, of course, covering backs with him out. But as of right now, if they're going to miss a couple of their inside linebackers in terms of guys that can cover a guy like Chase Edmonds, I think that's going to help Edmonds' cause this week. Jamaal Williams is my number 24. We got to talk about another PPR back, specifically one that plays in a revenge game. He plays against his former team, the Green Bay Packers. This last week had 9 carries for 54 and a touchdown, 9 targets, 8 receptions, and 56 yards for 21 fantasy points. The fact that Jamaal Williams literally only played 30 of the 92 total offensive snaps speaks pretty much volumes that in 30 potential plays, the guy touched the ball 17 times. That is ridiculous in my opinion. In terms of a target percentage on the amount of routes that he ran and the amount of targets he saw, that was extremely high, almost in that 25% range. I mean, that is the sweet spot for receivers, much less a running back. We know how much Anthony Lynn wants to target their respective running backs. They're going to use Jamaal Williams like Austin Ekeler in comparison to that Melvin Gordon, Austin Ekeler duo that they had in Los Angeles in years past. I absolutely see a lot of value and potential for Jamaal Williams this week because, again, they should be in a negative game script and they should be throwing a lot this upcoming week and finding a lot of value with both their backs. Moving on to our number 25 this week, we have Josh Jacobs. He's currently dealing with a turf toe injury, and it's apparent based on last night's game. He had to change his shoes and, again, was limping majority of the time, that he is not healthy. And he has to play against Pittsburgh this week. It's not an easy matchup, but Josh Jacobs had the most Josh Jacobs week I've ever seen in my life. 10 carries for 34 yards. 3.4 yard per carry average. Okay, decent. Not the best, but decent. For 2 rushing touchdowns. That in itself is, that solidifies his week. That gets him 12 extra points that he had no business getting. But regardless, we're not going to take that away from him. He earned those touchdowns, and it could even be the case that he scores like that against Pittsburgh this upcoming week. We even saw Devin Singletary torch that defense on the ground. 11 carries for 72 yards. I think Josh Jacobs is safe at 25. I think there's other running backs that have higher upside based on matchup. The fact that he's injured. He didn't practice much last week. Kenny Drake's getting more involvement. That could be tough for him, and that is why I put him at 25. Melvin Gordon's our number 26. Now, I'm going to go ahead and add number 27 to this conversation because, once again, we sit in a situation where we don't know who the starting running back of this team is because they both played 50% of the offensive snaps. Javonte Williams had more touches than Melvin Gordon, but yet Melvin Gordon had the 70-yard rushing touchdown, which gave him the supreme fantasy value. The question is, what can we anticipate in the matchup? They should both score. Honestly, they should both score. They play against Jacksonville, guys. The Jacksonville Jaguars gave up a touchdown to not only Mark Ingram, to Phillip Lindsay, and to David Johnson. In my opinion, if Tyrod Taylor can lead an offense and torch that defense, then why can't Teddy Bridgewater, with these running backs and the fantastic offensive line that they have up front, bruising defenders? I think Melvin Gordon and Javonte Williams both have value, can both be flex plays this week based on an incredible matchup. Both are getting, of course, 11 to 14 rushing attempts, a handful of targets in the PPR game. In my opinion, they both have incredible value, and the matchup itself is going to lend to their upside. But as of right now, I slightly favor Melvin Gordon because he is the veteran, and though he didn't have as many touches, maybe they'll continue to kind of even it out going in his way. We move on to Devin Singletary as our number 28. Singletary was incredible this last week. I mean, the shocking news that, Zach Moss was going to be out before the game and he was not going to be present certainly did move up Devin Singletary in my mind, but playing against Pittsburgh was not an easy matchup. Yet, 11 carries, 72 rushing yards, 3 receptions on 5 targets for 8 yards. Obviously, the PPR work wasn't there, but he got some receptions. That's great. This upcoming week, if in fact Zach Moss is out once again, I love Devin Singletary in this number 28 spot because playing against the Miami Dolphins, I mean, we saw not only Damien Harris on the ground, 23 carries for 100 yards, find a lot of success, but we saw James White catch the ball 6 times for 49 yards. I think we could see a combination of that kind of men together and give Devin Singletary a lot of success. I mean, when we talk about what the Bills do to the Dolphins, the last time we saw these two teams play against each other, what was it, 56 to 26 in week 17? I mean, the Dolphins cannot stop Josh Allen in this offense. I think they're going to have a little bit of a rebound week after a very, very lackluster performance against Pittsburgh. Devin Singletary is a fantastic flex option. Moving on to our number 29, we have Leonard Fournette. Of course, I believe that Leonard Fournette is the starter for this team. The fact that he was able to play the most snaps, against 64% of it this last Thursday, in comparison to, of course, Giovanni Bernard coming in, Ronald Jones coming in. Ronald Jones fumbling that ball definitely did kind of end his afternoon. But as of right now, Leonard Fournette, in my opinion, is the consensus 3-down back of this team that even with Ronald Jones potentially coming in every now and then, Leonard Fournette is going to play and get majority of the touches in this backfield because of the success he's found. The last time he played against the Atlanta Falcons in a full capacity was week 14 of the 2020 season. Had himself 14 carries for 49 rushing yards and 2 rushing touchdowns. I think we could see something very similar to that because Tom Brady and this offense should be able to put up a good number against this defense and, of course, run the clock out and run the ball, something they weren't able to do this past week against the Cowboys. They'll definitely get into this upcoming week. We have Myles Gaskin as our number 30. My concern with Myles Gaskin is opportunity. He had 14 total touches, 9 carries for 49 yards. We'll take that. That's fantastic. We'll take that. A total of 5 receptions on 5 targets for 26 yards, ends up getting him 10.1 fantasy points. What concerns me is Malcolm Brown coming in and taking rushing attempts, and Salvin Ahmed coming in and getting receptions. A rotation at the backfield is not something that I want for Myles Gaskin, and nor is it something that can sustain and keep him in the flex opportunity every single week in my lineup. That is why I have him at 30, because there are better options than him this week, because he's not going to get the full reign of opportunity that we all anticipate. The Bills matchup is a tougher one because they were able to just completely shut out the running game of the Pittsburgh Steelers, and though Ben Roethlisberger was able to get them to a 17-point comeback victory, I still do believe that Myles Gaskin needs to show me more for me to believe in him and get him higher up in these rankings. We have James Robinson as our number 31. I'm not at panic mode with James Robinson, but I'm almost there. The fact that Carlos Hyde had more rushing attempts than him this last week is unbelievably concerning. I want to go ahead and mention that because it is something that we have to keep an eye out on. Because if James Robinson is going to be splitting snaps, he is absolutely rendered as an RB3. And that is not good considering their snap counts weren't very great either. James Robinson played 63% of the offensive snaps, still only had 6 targets, 3 receptions. Touching the ball 8 times when you're playing 63% of the snaps is horrible, but that mainly had to do with game script, right? When you're getting blown out by the Houston Texans, what are you supposed to do? But now they play against Denver. I know Denver's not going to blow them out, but they might end up eventually getting to a 30-point lead by the 4th quarter. It's not going to be an immediate thing. Hopefully, James Robinson can find himself some success. Again, they play against Denver. It is a tougher matchup. So that is why we render him as an RB3 and our number 31 on the week. Number 32 is Nyheim Hines. Nyheim Hines actually looked really good this last week. Besides the fact that he ran the ball 9 times for 34 yards, got himself 8 total targets, 6 receptions, and 48 receiving yards. Now, you may be wondering, Andrew, is Nyheim Hines cutting into Jonathan Taylor's work? Yeah, potentially could be a factor there, but Nyheim Hines is lining up out wide, lining up in the slot, catching the ball. So he's not really being used that much in the backfield. There's a reason why Nyheim Hines is still playing 45% of the offensive snaps in this offense. Sometimes they're on the field at the same time. So regardless of whether or not Jonathan Taylor is in that backfield, Nyheim Hines still has value. And in my opinion, the 11.2 points that he put up last week is not a fluke. It was very much so game script dependent that they go ahead and check down the ball underneath to their respective running backs because they were finding a lot of success there. But when they play against the Rams this upcoming week, could be another factor in which they continue to throw the ball to the running back. Saquon's my number 33. For those of you who have been wondering, where is Saquon? Why hasn't he been mentioned? Well, Saquon was nothing this last Sunday. Playing against the Denver Broncos, he unfortunately only had 10 rushing attempts for 26 rushing yards and 1 catch for 1 yard on 3 total targets. 3.2 fantasy points, playing 48% of the offensive snaps. Saquon Barkley is not Saquon Barkley yet. I don't know how long it's going to take him, but I know they play on Thursday, and it's a very short week to go from shell of yourself to 2019, 2018 Saquon. We're not going to get there yet, guys. And that is why I put him at 33, because if you want to take the risk and you want to start him, go for it. But I'm not going to be caught with Saquon in my lineup this week. I won't. And there is a potential that he could be in the game and score a lucky rushing touchdown or maybe have a couple good plays here and there. We're not going to see the full Saquon until maybe like week 4. Hopefully sooner, but for right now, we got to stay conservative and we can't risk it too much by playing a guy like this that could end up burning us, especially in a very tough matchup against Washington. We have Mike Davis as our number 34. Mike Davis plays against Tampa Bay. I can't do it. I can't play Mike Davis this week. He played 77% of the offensive snaps. That in itself is incredible. We love those numbers, right? You're on the field often. You're running the ball 15 times for 49 yards, 6 total targets, 3 receptions, 23 yards. But to be honest, after the first 2 drives of this game, the Atlanta Falcons fell apart. Cordell Patterson's coming in, taking receptions, rushing attempts. It all looks bad. So as of this current moment in time, though we were able to get a guy like Mike Davis, 18 total touches, the matchup does not lend itself to leading to Mike Davis to some success this year. And specifically in this upcoming week, considering how bad that entire Atlanta offense looked. So as of right now, we leave him at 34. Number 35 is James White. If you want to go ahead and take a potential stab at grabbing a PPR running back and finding only value in the PPR work, if you're playing a full PPR format, of course, you can go ahead and ride James White this week against the Jets because they're going to have the ball the whole time. Again, James White, 6 receptions, 49 receiving yards, 12 rushing yards this last week on 4 carries. Played about 37% of the offensive snaps, 9.1 fantasy points. I think he can do something very similar this week, maybe even more. Maybe could accompany with a touchdown, but the touchdown's ever so elusive, and there's a reason why we typically don't assume that with a running back 3 option like James White. The last member of the top 36 running back rankings is Mark Ingram II. Yes, Mark Ingram may have been or may be in your waiver wire pickup list as of right now, but playing against Cleveland, it's not going to be like playing against the Jaguars. Yeah, he touched the ball 26 times on the ground for 85 yards and a touchdown, but if this upcoming week he rushes the ball for 14 times, 40 yards, and doesn't score a touchdown and doesn't get PPR work, you got a 4-point running back. So that's what we have to be concerned about because there are other running backs that maybe Phillip Lindsay breaks out the run. Maybe David Johnson gets the opportunity. There's so many mouths to feed in this offense out of the backfield that it is sketchy to 100% invest in one guy and even grab him and throw him in immediately going into week 2. I don't think you'll be that desperate. I would probably lean towards a wide receiver. Specifically, one of my top 36 wide receivers that we'll talk about tomorrow. This pretty much concludes my top 36 running back rankings for week 2 of the 2021 fantasy football season. Like I just mentioned, we'll be talking about wide receivers tomorrow afternoon. So make sure that if you have not yet already, subscribe down below. Thank you very much for spending your time here today. Make sure you click that like button. Let me know what you guys think about the rankings down below in the comment section. I appreciate the continued support. Again, if you guys are trying to find all my 2021 extra content outside of the channel, my rankings, questions and answers, all that kind of stuff, go down to the description of the video, find my Patreon. Again, thank you again for watching. You guys are the best. And until tomorrow, I'll see you guys. Peace. Bye.